Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak to the motion put forward by my colleague, the member for Wellington Halton Hills, on the Speaker's ruling of a prima facie determination that the member's privileges were breached as a result of tactics of intimidation employed by a diplomat at Beijing's Toronto consulate. This motion arises from a May 1st report in the Globe and Mail in which it was revealed that a July 20th, 2021 CSIS intelligence assessment had identified that a Beijing diplomat had sought to sanction and intimidate the family in Hong Kong of a member for Wellington Halton Hills as retribution for that member bringing forward a motion in this House to call out the Beijing regime for their gross human rights violations in East Turkestan and to call those gross human rights violations out for what they are, and that is a genocide. It was an attempt by the Beijing regime to have a chill effect on a sitting member, to interfere in that member's ability to do his job and to fulfill his duties as a member of Parliament, to speak in this House, to put forward a motion, to stand in his place, and to vote on that motion on the basis of principle on behalf of his constituents and on behalf of Canadians. This is about as serious as it gets. For 2 years, the Liberals sat on that information. They sat on a Beijing diplomat seeking to undermine our democracy by interfering with the ability of the member for Wellington Halton Hills to perform his duties as a member of Parliament. And not only that, they sat on the fact that Beijing's Toronto consulate was also involved in other intimidation and interference activities affecting members of Parliament. Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister claimed that he knew nothing about it, that he learned about it in the Globe and Mail. Last Wednesday, the Prime Minister then tried to change the channel by blaming CSIS. He said, quote, "CSIS made the determination that it wasn't something that needed to be raised to a higher level because it wasn't a significant enough concern," end of quote. Wasn't a significant enough concern. Madam Speaker, then on Thursday, the member for Wellington Halton Hills was informed by the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, Jody Thomas, that the Prime Minister's assertion wasn't true. That in fact, that July CSIS intelligence assessment had been sent to the National Security Advisor of the PCO as well as all of the relevant departments. And so, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister's claim that he didn't know anything about it just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up based upon what the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff told committee, namely that he is briefed regularly about national security matters, that he reads everything, and that nothing is held back. The Prime Minister's denial doesn't add up based on what CSIS told committee, which is that CSIS definitely briefs the government when hostile foreign governments target politicians, and the Prime Minister's denial that he knew anything doesn't add up based upon what the Prime Minister's own National Security Advisor told the member for Wellington Halton Hills. No one believes the Prime Minister that he didn't know. No one believes him. So he should just stop the charade and come clean, that he covered it up, that he covered it up for the Beijing regime. Now, even though no one believes him, if I were to, for a minute, try to believe him, I would say that it's an equal indictment on this Prime Minister's complete lack of fitness to lead this country. This is a Prime Minister who is the leader of our country. He is responsible for the machinery of government. He is responsible for the broad organization and structure of government, and he has special responsibilities when it comes to national security. And so for the Prime Minister to say he didn't know is no excuse at all. It is an admission on the part of the Prime Minister that he doesn't care, that he's asleep at the switch, that he's not doing his job, and he's not protecting the safety and security of Canadians, including sitting members of Parliament, from being intimidated from being able to do their job seriously in the face of an unprecedented campaign of interference by the Beijing regime, all taking place under this Prime Minister's watch. Shame. And then, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister decided to change the channel. To, instead of taking responsibility, I mean, this is a Prime Minister, I guess in the last 8 years, I can't remember a time that he's ever taken responsibility. He's never responsible. So what did the Prime Minister do instead of acknowledging that he is the Prime Minister, that he is responsible for the machinery of government, that he does have special responsibilities for government? He then blamed the member for Wellington Halton Hills. He sent 2 of his parliamentary secretaries down into this chamber on Thursday to falsely assert that the member for Wellington Halton Hills had been briefed, that he knew that his family was in harm's way, and he knew so for 2 years, but that he didn't tell his family, that he didn't tell his colleagues, and essentially that he was misleading Canadians now to make a big deal about what certainly is a big deal. It was my motion, when I was speaking to it, to kick off debate around calling for, among other things, a public inquiry into foreign interference and expelling the Beijing diplomat involved in this intimidation campaign, which the Liberals voted against today. In the course of that debate, the member for Kingston and the Island asserted that. I have to admit, I was floored by what I was hearing. I couldn't believe what he was saying. And then the member for Winnipeg Centre doubled down, Winnipeg North, doubled down on that misinformation to blame the member for Wellington Halton Hills. Now, in fairness, the member for Winnipeg North has stated that he didn't have his facts straight, which is a start. He should apologize, but it's a start that he didn't do the right thing that day. And the member for Kingston and the Islands has apologized, but not the Prime Minister. he hasn't shown at least some level of class that the member for Winnipeg North and the member for Kingston of the Islands have demonstrated. No. The Prime Minister has doubled down on his misinformation campaign. He directed those members to come into this House and spread misinformation, and then the very next day, he continued to spread the misinformation and continued his attack on the member for Wellington Halton Hills. Here's what the Prime Minister said on Friday. Quote, "I was reassured to see that Mr. Chong had received multiple briefings following the information collected by CSIS to ensure that he and his family were kept safe or would at least know what was going on in the extent that they needed to and they could be briefed." End of quote. Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister knew on Friday that the member for Wellington Halton Hills had been briefed once, and he had not been briefed about the particulars concerning Zhao Wei and the efforts to intimidate him by sanctioning his family because of how he voted in this House. The Prime Minister was aware on Friday that the member for Wellington Halton Hills had received a briefing of a general nature that had nothing to do with the matter. And yet, in the face of that, we have a Prime Minister who was spreading this misinformation on Friday. Why? Why would the Prime Minister do that? Is that a Prime Minister who is genuinely concerned about the well-being of the member for Wellington Halton Hills family in Hong Kong? Is that a Prime Minister who has the integrity to admit that his government didn't get it right, that the member should have been briefed? No, it's not that of a Prime Minister with integrity. It is a Prime Minister who is using every tactic in the book to change the channel, to avoid accountability, and in the most disgusting of ways, engage in victim blaming by trying to disgracefully impugn the integrity of the member for Wellington Halton Hills, a member who I have gotten to know over the last 8 years, that many members across this House, in all corners of the House, have gotten to know. And if there's one thing that can be said of a member for Wellington Halton Hills, is that he is a member of principle and integrity. He doesn't deserve this. If the Prime Minister had any integrity, he would apologize, and he would apologize now to the member for Wellington Halton Hills for spreading this kind of misinformation. Madam Speaker, this is part of a pattern that we have seen. The Prime Minister covers up issues of interference with our elections by Beijing, intimidation attempts by Beijing diplomats accredited in Canada. It gets reported on in the media, and then the Prime Minister tries to offer up excuses, blame others, and say there's nothing to see here at all. Nothing that we know about Beijing's interference in our elections or by Beijing diplomats is a result of anything that this Prime Minister has said. CSIS has advised the Prime Minister that the best approach to dealing with matters of foreign interference is sunshine and transparency. But there has been no sunshine, there has been no transparency, there's just been one cover-up after another. And, Madam Speaker, only because the Prime Minister got caught in covering up for this Beijing diplomat, only now, 1 week after the Globe and Mail first reported this, did the government this afternoon, after voting against the official opposition motion, finally send Zhao Wei packing. It took the government, it took the Prime Minister 2 years.
Unbelievable.
I can remember when the Minister of Foreign Affairs came before the Procedure and House Affairs Committee a month ago, a little over a month ago. And this report in the Globe and Mail had not come to light, but there was plenty of evidence that Beijing diplomats, particularly at the Toronto consulate as well as the Vancouver consulate, had been engaged in election interference activities. And so in the face of that, I put it to the minister, why is it that not a single Beijing diplomat had been expelled? And the Minister of Foreign Affairs incredibly talked about a lack of evidence. Well, obviously, the minister and the government did have evidence. They had evidence with respect to Zhao Wei, because they knew about it 2 years ago, but there she was saying there wasn't evidence. Well, now a week later, now that it's been reported in the Globe and Mail, there finally was the evidence to send her packing, to send him packing, rather. But why did it take 2 years? And by the way, what is the minister talking about with respect to the need for evidence? What is the parliamentary secretary talking about? The need for due process. With respect to these Beijing diplomats, there doesn't need to be due process. What there needs to be is that when there's findings of interference, Article 9 gives the government the unfettered discretion to expel any diplomat at any time for any reason. And yes, it's true. Yes, it's true that making a decision to expel a diplomat does or could result in retaliatory measures taken by the Beijing regime. And I acknowledge that is something that this government and any government would have to weigh. But let me also say there is a cost of inaction. And I would submit that that cost in these circumstances is far greater. It is simply intolerable that we have Beijing diplomats who are involved in facilitating the clandestine transfer of funding to candidates, that are involved in targeting candidates, conservative candidates in the 2021 election, and then bragging about the role that they played in seeing that certain incumbent members of Parliament were defeated who they didn't like. It's intolerable that we have Beijing diplomats responsible for organizing police stations, illegal police stations, to harass and intimidate Chinese Canadians at what are effectively black sites. And it's intolerable that we have Beijing diplomats intimidating members of Parliament and their families. Madam Speaker, it should not have taken 2 years. It shouldn't have taken the Globe and Mail. And it shouldn't have taken a week of pressure from the official opposition for this government to finally send this Beijing diplomat home. Madam Speaker, when it comes to protecting our national security from Beijing, this Prime Minister is completely incompetent and completely unfit for office.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm wondering if the member can reflect in terms of question period and the questions that he had posed during the question period. And the Conservative Party knows last week the Prime Minister made very clear indication.
Order, the honourable member Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think the member across the way, it's really difficult to listen to his comments when he still hasn't apologized to the member. I wish he would today.
Point of order, the honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I find that it is unfortunate that the Conservative Party is taking a tactic to try to bully or intimidate me in being able to address the House. And I would ask that you take it under advisement and review the number of points of order and the heckling that I get when I stand up to be able to speak. I do not believe it is appropriate, as you can see the heckling going on right now.
Just one moment, please. Excuse me. Order. Order. I know that the honourable member raised a point of order asking for an apology. I wasn't here in the chamber when the question was put, or this issue was before the House on this particular matter. I understand that this was raised with the Speaker, and I would just say that at this point in time, I'm going to allow the honourable member to ask the question, and I'm sure that the honourable member from St. Albert Edmonton will be able to answer that. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And, you know, I'm sure if the member was to reflect in terms of the question period and the questions that he had asked, he made a very clear indication by saying the Prime Minister knew. And in fact, the Prime Minister was very clear in indicating that the Prime Minister, he did not know. So does the member believe that members should be respected when they say that they did not know, that the member is spreading misinformation by telling people that the Prime Minister did know? He can maybe reflect on that and look in terms of, does the member recognize in 2022 there was 49 members of Parliament that had the general briefings that were provided? Does he believe that 2022 was the only year that in fact that might have been happening for a number of years prior?
Première question. The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In answer, I have every reason to believe that the Prime Minister did know. After all, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor informed the member for Wellington Halton Hills that the National Security Advisor to the PCO and all relevant departments had been briefed, and similarly, that this information absolutely would have made its way to the Prime Minister. Now, given the fact that the Prime Minister is the responsible for the machinery of government, that he has special responsibilities for national security, if something as significant as this didn't reach his desk, if he had set up a government that shielded himself from being informed about this, then that is no excuse. That is an indictment on this Prime Minister and underscores what I said in the conclusion of my speech, that he is completely unfit for the office that he serves, and he's completely unfit to protect the national security interests of Canadians.
Well said.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for the speech. Now, the government has admitted that the Speaker of the House made the right decision today, so that bears repeating. But there are a lot of questions, though, that remain unanswered. Why did it take so long? Why didn't they face the issue head on? Now, would my colleague agree with me that we would have saved a lot of time in the House and that we could have debated many other important topics that affect Canadians, such as health, seniors, climate change?
St. Albert, Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, if we had a competent Prime Minister and a competent government that took national security seriously, two things would have happened following that July 21st CSIS assessment. Number one, the member for Wellington Halton Hills would have been immediately informed that a Beijing diplomat was targeting the safety and security of his family and threatening his ability to do his job in this place on behalf of his constituents and on behalf of Canadians. And secondly, that diplomat would have been sent packing to Beijing immediately, not 2 years after the fact.
Any comments? The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Edmonton for his intervention today. I have some concerns about how we are going forward with this discussion and how we are building a stronger democracy in Canada. And I wonder if the member, I know him to be very thoughtful, and I wonder if the member could speak about, where are those circumstances where we have to keep things private. With regards to national security, we know not everything can be public. And I'm struggling right now, I'm sure many people in this House are struggling with knowing where that line is and how we protect that line, that very important line of public security, but also having the ability to be transparent, also have the ability to ensure that parliamentarians know when they're at risk and when their families are at risk.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my friend from Edmonton, Strathcona, for the question. She does raise a point, but I would submit that under this government, the pendulum is way over on the other side. No transparency and no sunlight. And the advice of CSIS to the Prime Minister has been that in order to combat foreign interference, there needs to be transparency and sunlight. So when you have a situation as serious as a member of Parliament being intimidated because of the position that they took in this House and how they voted, and that their family was being threatened and sanctioned potentially in Hong Kong by an accredited diplomat in Canada, the member for Wellington Halton Hills should have been made aware, and the Canadian public should have been made aware, and that Beijing diplomat should have been sent back to Beijing then, not 2 years after the fact.
In comments, the honourable member for Charles Woods, St. James, Assiniboia, Heckling.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And it's on that point that I wanted to ask the member. The diplomat was expelled today, 2 years too late. Has been operating on Canadian soil for 2 years. The government knew about it. Isn't this government negligent?
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, I couldn't agree more with the member for Charles Woods, St. James, Assiniboia, Heckling. This diplomat should have been expelled immediately, and the government had all the tools at their disposal, including Article 9, that gives the government, Article 9 of the Vienna Convention, that gives the government the unfettered discretion to expel any diplomat at any time for any reason. And instead, the government didn't do that, and in so doing, they sent a message to Beijing that Beijing effectively has a green light to interfere in our democracy and our sovereignty to the detriment of the safety and security of Chinese Canadians and all Canadians.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, the member for St. Albert, Edmonton, spoke about foreign interference with respect to one particular jurisdiction. Colleagues of ours, including the member for Edmonton Strathcona, have called out that we know there is foreign interference with respect to other jurisdictions as well. Russia is one example. And I wonder if the member for St. Albert, Edmonton can reflect on at what point, or does he feel that we should be looking at a full national public inquiry into all matters of foreign interference, regardless of what jurisdiction it's from.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, first of all, the member is absolutely right that it's not only the Beijing regime that is a threat in terms of interfering in our sovereignty and our democracy, but the Canadian security establishment, including CSIS, has been very clear that by far and away, the biggest threat emanates from the Beijing regime. There are other regimes, such as the Iranian regime, that are interfering in Canada and intimidating and threatening Iranian Canadians. There's something this government could do to stop that, and that is to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity so they can stop recruiting and fundraising and intimidating Iranian Canadians. But this government's soft approach, after 4 years after this House voted overwhelmingly to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity, hasn't seen fit to do that. It's just another example of this government not taking national security seriously, not putting the interests of Canadians first.
Time for a brief question. The honourable member for Edmonton, Wetaskiwin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, on Thursday, while my honourable Conservative colleague was speaking, he was being heckled by members on the Liberal side, particularly the member from Kingston and the Islands and the member from Winnipeg North. The member from Winnipeg North said in his heckle, quote, about the member from Wellington, Halton Hills, said, quote, the member's not credible. So,
Oops. I've got a point of order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes. Madam Speaker, the last time the member stood up on this point of order, he crossed the floor and threatened...
Can I just hear out the member for a second so I can see whether it's a point of order or not?
Yes, Madam Speaker, the last time the member stood up on the floor on this issue, he commented on it, I raised it, then he walked across the floor and threatened me, Madam Speaker. The member said to me that... Madam Speaker, the member said to me that he is going to continue to rise on this issue until I apologize for something in which I do not believe I have to apologize for. I do not believe a member crossing the floor and making those type of verbal threats, Madam Speaker, is appropriate, and I would ask that the Speaker look into the matter, as I indicated earlier, about members and what actions they are taking in order to try to intimidate members of the government.
So I'm going to review the Hansard, as I'm sure that the Speaker, when this was brought forward, I would say that we will check to see if the recordings are into Hansard, because it's I wasn't privy to this, and again, you know, we don't always hear everything that's going on in the chamber. I would just ask members to be judicial in their language to each other and to be respectful. And I know that this is a very, very important debate. And it can be very emotional at times, and I would just ask the member to ask his question. It's a brief question that we're at, so that we can get to the next speaker as well. So we have a point of order. The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil on the same point of order.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing I noticed when you were standing up, the member's light was still on, and it's convention around this place. In fact, it's standing rules around this place that when the speaker does rise from his or her chair, that the lights are immediately cut off and the debate is ended. So I just want clarification on that.
It all depends on whether I stay standing or not. Sometimes it's still on while I'm listening to the members, so I take note, and we'll certainly keep that in mind as we move forward. The honourable member for Edmonton Wetaskiwin, I would just ask him to please ask the question briefly, and so we can get to the answer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The honourable member is correct. I did walk across. I said, If you don't apologize for it, I'm going to keep asking the question, and I'll keep asking the question.
I would just ask the honourable member to ask a question to the honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton, and we can leave this other debate to the side so that we can go back and look at the Hansard.
Does he believe the honourable member for Winnipeg North should stand right now and apologize for saying that the member from Wellington Halton Hills was not credible?
So this is not becoming a point of debate. It's somebody's point of view. So I would just ask the honourable parliamentary secretary. We're going to allow the honourable member to answer, and then we're going to move on. The honourable member of St. Albert Edmonton.
In short, the answer to my colleague's question is yes. Through you, Madam Speaker, do you know who was intimidated? It's not the member for Winnipeg North. It's the member for Wellington, Halton Hills, and for 2 years the Prime Minister covered it up.